Today on Science Fiction Fantasy Network, I'm talking to Jeremy Zuckerman. He is an Emmy Award-winning composer, best known for his work on Avatar: The Last Airbender, Kung Fu Panda, The Legends of Awesome, and of course, The Legend of Korra. Jeremy, thanks for talking to us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about what was your first instrument? What made you first want to pick up an instrument and say, I want to learn?
My first instrument, like a lot of musicians and composers, was piano. My mom started teaching me, I guess I was around 5. She was an amateur musician and really loved music, and her father was an amateur musician and really loved music, and it was sort of this line of musicians. In fact, I guess my grandfather wooed my grandma by playing piano, playing standards in the cafeteria when he was like 14 or 15, and then he snagged her, and then they stayed together forever. So she got me involved in piano, and I wasn't really into it that much. I mean, I was interested in it, but it wasn't really clicking for me. And we'd have arguments, it wasn't great being taught by your mom. And then eventually I picked up the sax, and I played that for a little while, but it wasn't my instrument either. It just sort of physically irritated me, because I had really bad teeth. I was just born with crappy teeth. And so it would vibrate my brain. I liked playing it, but the physical experience was very uncomfortable for me. So I decided I needed to switch to something back using my hands. Someone played me Hendrix, and I was like, I want to learn electric guitar. That sounds awesome, And right around the same time, someone played me Black Sabbath, and I was hearing the tones of these guitars, these wall of sound. I was like, that sounds incredible. So, my parents agreed to buy me an electric guitar, and I took it home and plugged it in, and it, of course, didn't sound anything like that because I didn't know about distortion pedals, and it's like, what's wrong with this thing, And it took me a while to sort of figure it out, but as soon as I really started playing guitar, then something clicked, and I started writing music and got in a band at a young age, and quickly felt the passion for music. That was around 10 years old, and and around 13, I just decided that with, a friend, I sat down with a friend and we were talking one night. It was one of those, like, what do you want to do with your life things? And I decided, I was going to do music, and it seemed like a real risk at the time. I couldn't imagine doing anything else. And so I was kind of lucky in that sense that early on I knew what I wanted to do, and I just sort of had to follow that path, Well,
you mentioned Sabbath and Hendrix there. Mm-hmm. What were some of your favourite bands growing up then?
I was into a lot of heavy metal and Ozzy and all that stuff, and Randy Rhoads and all those sort of virtuosic guitarists, There were bands like Cornah and Forbidden and Sanctuary, which were a little less known, sort of underground metal bands. And of course there was Metallica and Megadeth and Anthrax and all that stuff that I was trying to play around 13, 14 years old. Then I got into Pink Floyd. And at the same time, my parents would, especially my dad, would be playing classical and contemporary new music stuff in the house. And so I'd hear, Philip Glass and Steve Reich and stuff like that. And it sounded weird to me at the time. Now it actually sounds traditional to me. It's funny. But at the time it sounded really strange, but I was intrigued by it. But it, really I was a kid and I was into popular music and things like that. Guns N' Roses, But mainly, I did not have a traditional musical upbringing. I did take classical guitar for a little while and went to music school, so I studied traditional music, but for me, the passion was in the more contemporary stuff, like heavy metal and things of that sort. And eventually that led me to electronic music and computer music and some pretty sort of avant-garde stuff. And that led me back to new music like Luciano Berio and Ioannis Xenakis and Penderecki and, guys like that, and the 20th century composers who were doing stuff with the orchestra that was really non-traditional.
It was Ben Wynn, he met with Bryan, was it? He first met with and got you involved in Avatar?
Yes, Ben was roommates with Bryan. This was around 2000 maybe. And Ben and I were friends because we were both going to Cal Arts, California Institute of the Arts. And so we became buddies there. And I met Bryan through Ben, so I became friends with Bryan too. And Bryan was really interested in what we were doing at Cal Arts. Because Bryan, he's an artist. He went to RISD, and he's interested in all kinds of art, And we were doing some esoteric stuff over at Cal Arts, and he was really interested in that. So he and Mike DiMartino started developing Avatar, and they were interested in having people who weren't from the animation world come in and work on the show, in other words, people who weren't sort of schooled in the tropes of the musical tropes of animation. He wanted a very different sounding score and sound design. It was a bit of a battle, but he brought us in. It was a bit of a battle with the network because we didn't have the experience. Somehow he knew, it'd be all right, which was a real risk in my, now being older, I see that as like, wow, that was a really crazy idealistic risk. And I hope it paid off for him, and I'm really glad he did it because, it was the first big step in my career. It was kind of a crazy thing because he had never, the only music he had heard us do was this very avant-garde stuff, but he took that chance.
So how did you prepare for Avatar? Because the style it does have quite what to a lot of Western ears is quite unusual. And you said you grew up with, heavy metal and avant-garde.
Yeah.
How did you prepare? What did you listen to prepare for it?
Let's see. I started studying pipa and gujin. I found a private teacher, and I studied that for a couple of years while Avatar was happening. I listened to a lot of Chinese music. Actually, Bryan would recommend all kinds of music. He listens to. He's like an avid listener, and he's a musician himself, and he just knows so many different artists and delves into that stuff all day long. And so he had all kinds of interesting references, and so he would just throw these references at us all day long, and I would analyze them and figure out what's going on and get obsessed with something for a week, and like something else for another week, and it was really intense. It was a really intense time. I mean, he wanted Duduk for the Blue Spirit, which was one of the Avatar episodes. I had never touched the instrument, but I found this pawn shop in Glendale, and their pawn shop / Duduk source. So
it's remarkably specific.
Yeah, it was so strange, and I thought I was in the wrong place when I bought it. I walk into this pawn shop. I had no idea it was because I found it online, Duduk.com. And I go in and it's a pawn shop, and it takes me in the back, and there's all these great Duduks, and he's demonstrating for me, and he sounds amazing. So anyway, I brought it home, and with the power of editing, computer editing, I was able to hodgepodge some parts together, and also, with my sort of lack of experience and in my youth, I was able to just go for it, without occurring to me that it was kind of insane what I was doing, trying to pull it off. But I don't know. I think Bryan and Mike, their faith is so strong in us that it was able, I felt like I couldn't fail. I felt secure, even though, like, ordinarily I think I'd be like, I don't want to put this out in the world, that's great, I'm going to make an ass out of myself. Yeah, they were just like, you can do it. I was like, okay.
So what were some of the challenges in writing music for instruments like an erhu or a gujin? Some instruments that often work on a completely different scale to what we might be used to.
Yeah. Some of it definitely was some pitch stuff, getting the intonation to work, because like Duduk isn't necessarily tuned perfectly to equal tempered, as far as I understand. But then again, that's all embouchure, that's all your mouth technique. So I was able to tweak it with lips and things to get it in tune. And at the time, I didn't have particularly good like pitch correction software or anything like that. So it was a lot more just sort of performative and editing. Gujin and pipa are tuned. They're pretty much on the piano, on the keyboard, So they're just pentatonic. Although actually pipa is chromatic. Like you can do anything you want, and you bend the strings as well on the pipa and gujin. But gujin is laid out pentatonically traditionally. Although you can tune those strings to anything you want, you could get really creative with it. But I think I stayed pretty traditional with the tuning with that stuff. A lot of it was my ignorance and just sort of playing it somewhat non-traditionally. And that was one of the things Bryan had said early on, was that he had this idea of using these non-Western instruments, but not necessarily using them traditionally. Like with a real beginner's mind, you just sort of pick it up and say, hey, what sounds does this thing make, with very little education. And he was actually really interested in that approach. And mine was sort of somewhere in between those two poles of like knowing what I was doing and not knowing what I was doing on the instruments, because I was I was studying privately, but of course just scratching the surface.
So when you came to do Korra a few years later, there's a kind of like a musical evolution has gone on, like presumably within your own skill as well as in the universe, and you start mashing up the traditional sounds with more jazz and 1920s style stuff.
Right.
What was that like developing?
Again, that was like, delving into ragtime and the early jazz, Kid Ory and the King Oliver and like these sort of early ragtime artists. And I had a little bit of time before Korra started, so I could get into that for a while, and driving around just whenever I could, just listening to that music, analyzing it, making charts, looking at the chord progressions, looking at the melodies and how they, the phrasing, and just trying to really study it as quickly as I could, but with some depth, trying not to just sound like I'm attempting to recreate a style that I have no right to doing. But and then also
was that something you were conscious of then? Yeah, you don't want to be seen as someone who's just stealing from another culture, as it were.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Well, I didn't think of it in terms of stealing, but I thought of it in terms of presenting it in a way that's disrespectful. And that was also something I was conscious of, even as far going back to Avatar, like assigning different instruments to different characters. I didn't want like a certain culture to be ascribed to the bad guys, and another culture to be ascribed to the good guys. And that was also part of the advantage of not being super traditional musically, because that I was really afraid, like conscious of doing that.
Going back to what you're talking about, writing non-Western instruments in a sort of to a more Western, shall we say, style. Mm-hmm. The Playfest suite, how involved were you in those, the Avatar one and the Korra one?
I was pretty involved in them. So I organized the layout, the musical layout, and then I sent my music to my orchestrator, to Chris Rose. And Chris did a really great job orchestrating. That was the first time and the only time I've worked with an orchestrator.
Did you have to, because I realised they didn't have the same instruments a lot of the time, so
right.
What was it like transposing?
Yeah, so there was a bit of back and forth between Chris and me, where he'd say, how about like the marimba takes over the kalimba part, or how about, maybe we combine that with vibes or something to get it a bit more metallic sounding. And there was a bit of back and forth, but Chris really took the reins on the orchestration of those suites. And then there was a bit of also back and forth about like transposing certain sections to get it to move a bit differently. So there's certain cues that are not in their original key, just so that the context of the whole suite flowed in a certain way and had some kind of dynamic movement tonally. So there's different tonal shifts and things like that. But so there was definitely back and forth. Chris did definitely the heavy lifting on that stuff, and it was really interesting giving away some of that creative freedom. I don't usually do that. I don't like have anyone write for me or anything like that. And I'm not bragging about it. It's actually I'd probably be a lot better off if I had more help in that department. But I just have a really difficult time letting go of that creative control. It's so important to me, I mean, I'm sure at some point, if I get a certain project, I'll need to do that. I'll just need to have people come in and help me write, depending on the scope of the project.
To give you enough budget as well.
Yeah, if I'm lucky enough to. Yeah, that's part of it too, definitely. But yeah, it was quite interesting having Chris help out, and I was really, he did things that I wouldn't have done, but I really liked I really liked them, and that was kind of interesting too. I got to be a bit of an audience member as well as a composer on that one. So
when you are writing music for Avatar and for Korra, and presumably for the other shows you've worked on, you do spotting sessions with Bryan and Mike on those. Can you take us through what one of those is like? I mean, one of the ones I'm particularly interested in is the Zuko and Azula battle from the finale of Avatar, right, where you have this very somber music, very much in contrast to the big dramatic music for Aang and Ozai. Was that something that came out in the spotting session? Yeah,
I have to go back to that one. That's years ago. Let me see. I remember having a conversation after the spotting session. So I remember actually having difficulty with that cue. And I think at that point I was just kind of worn out, It was like near the end of the whole thing. It was a lot of work. Those last 4 episodes were a ton of work. I brought in a live string ensemble for that, and before then I had been doing everything myself, and it was all MIDI. All the strings were MIDI, and so I was trying all kinds of. I was like a kid in a candy store because I was able to use live musicians, and I was trying all these things that were taking a lot of time, and very work intensive. So at that point I was pretty worn out, and I remember calling Bryan like late at night. I'm stuck on this cue, I don't know what to do here, because I mean, like the spotting sessions, there's different levels of detail. Like sometimes it's just like we need to support this moment. Sometimes Bryan would have musical direction as far as like, hey, like references. Other times it was left open where we're not sure exactly where to come in, where to end, or if there even needs to be music here, try something. So it's sort of all over the place as far as that goes. But I remember calling Bryan and I was stuck on that cue, and I don't remember what the spotting notes were for there. I'm sure it was just they battle, but I think Bryan and Mike did say that it needed to be more of a tragic musical idea because what was happening was really sad, brother and sister battling, essentially to the end. But so it was a big deal. It wasn't your average. Like basically what they wanted was the music to touch on the subtext, and not just to score the surface. The subtext is quite sad, And I remember calling him and he was just like, just do something simple, like, you know. And I was like, all right, you know, and I went I was thinking, you know, it was getting way too complex in my brain, and I went back and sort of did something really simple and wrote it pretty quickly after that, you know, within probably an hour or something. And I wasn't even, you know, everyone really loves that cue. It's so funny, and I like it now too because of the way it works, but at the time, it didn't seem any more or less special than anything else, really, you know?
It's definitely one of the tracks that has, you know, appeared on the internet via means of, you know, questionable legality.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of that. That's all right.
I mean, on that note, you know, the Book 1 soundtrack to Korra sold very, very well, I seem to recall. Did that surprise you at the time?
Yeah, it did. It surprised me when it was at number 1, like, against Man of Steel. I think it was Man of Steel was up at the same time. And it surpassed Man of Steel for a little while. I didn't expect to get anywhere near that. Because, you know, that's a huge marketing machine behind Man of Steel. And there was no marketing, really, virtually, behind the Korra soundtrack. You know,
as fans looking from the outside, we often felt like Nickelodeon didn't really know what to do with Avatar and Korra, because it was so different from everything else on that network.
Yeah, I agree. But it was great that they let it happen. They didn't handle all the things with Korra well, in my opinion. Probably shouldn't say that, but that's okay. But, you know, they were, you know, the paradigm has been changing, and networks have been having, you know, a hard time figuring out what to do. You know, people don't watch live TV anymore, and it's very hard to gauge success, I think, you know. And so I think Korra was especially difficult, and then on top of everything else that was happening in the television landscape. But yeah, I think that they did have difficulty like figuring out the time slot, and then they kept changing things, and it definitely didn't do the show any favors. And I would have loved to have seen it, you know, on something like, I don't know, like Netflix, or, you know, like as a series. I think it would have been really popular. I mean, it was really popular, but it had a strange kind of ebb and flow.
I think, you know, given all the difficulties that seem to have surrounded Korra especially, you know, the fact that it came out as good as it did is a kind of testament to the entire production team, I think.
Yeah, everyone was really, really, really worked hard, and everyone was pushing themselves way past the point of enjoyment.
I mean, it felt like a labour of love, like, on every level.
It was, and sometimes you couldn't feel the love because it was so so painful. I know, looking back, it's great, like, that stuff didn't come out, because there was some really, everyone struggled at different times, and everyone wound up in dark places at different times for different amounts of time. But it was very difficult, and it was very ambitious. What we were doing with the budget we had, it made it very, you know, not just, you know, me musically, but I mean everyone, the whole production team. You know, there was a lot of work that went into it that was way above and beyond. I mean, that was the MO of the whole thing. And it went on for a while. It's a long time to work that way, you know.
It was like five years Korra was on?
Yeah, and I think it took its toll on everyone a bit, but I think we all probably would agree that it was worth it.
When you see people, you know, across the internet demanding a book 5, and I can't help thinking it would probably kill Mike and Bryan.
Yeah, I know, exactly. It probably would.
Maybe in another 5 years if they've had a
they need to. Yeah, they need to heal. And I don't know how they feel about it. I don't want to speak for them. They definitely probably need a break. A long break, and maybe, I don't know if they want to come back to it or not, you know.
As it stands, as it is, it's pretty much one of the best things that's been on TV for a long time, in my opinion.
Well, yeah, I was really, really proud to be a part of it, you know. But when it was all said and done, I really felt lucky and fortunate to have been a part of that whole experience.
Obviously, official soundtracks haven't been released for various reasons, right. But you're putting a lot of it out on SoundCloud.
Yeah.
You just put one up just last week, the Colossus one.
Right.
Is that something you're planning to continue to do?
You know, it's one of these weird things. I technically shouldn't be doing it, I think. I don't think that the network really cares. If they were to tell me to take it down, I would have to do that. It's a strange thing. Like, I think that they, you know, I've gotten some really beautiful comments about the music from kids and people at the network, and some really nice words about it. But it's just one of these things, like, it's just like to take the time to put a soundtrack out, even if it's a quick thing, it costs money, you know, even just the legal fees or whatever, the legal hours, I should say. And I don't know exactly what the holdup is, but I think that it's one of these things where it's just small potatoes, you know, even if it does well comparatively to the bigger things, you know. And I'm talking more like Sony now, who's, you know, releases the soundtrack. It's not really worth it to them. It's not.
Which is a shame because it means a lot to a lot of people.
I know.
Not just to yourself.
I know, and that's why I do this. That's why every once in a while I release something, because I hit a breaking point, every once in a while where after a certain amount of people have asked me for it, and in such a sort of sincere, endearing way, I just have to do something, because it just feels like I'm just tired of saying no. I don't know. I can't do it, and it's frustrating.
I mean,
it is frustrating.
The thing about the soundtrack, it's something that means a lot to me as well, because it's something I've used when I'm a writer as well, and it's something I listen to in my creative process. It's because I feel like it is very good for that.
Yeah, well, I love the idea that it's helping inspire people to create. I love that. I love that when I hear that writers use it, and I really, really would love to have the other books out. Even just as iTunes releases or whatever. I just want them to be available, and then that would feel like, also for me, it would be like closure.
And to all the people listening, Book One soundtrack is out at the moment. You can buy it and give Jeremy some royalties there.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
So, what's coming up next for you? What are you working on now?
Currently, I'm working on this documentary. It's called Bear Trek. This guy, it's sort of this another labor of love kind of thing. It's this guy, Chris Morgan, who's an environmentalist, ecologist. He's also a host on National Geographic Channel, and he's basically dedicated his whole life to bears, and he's traveled the world studying them in all these different habitats, and he's found that their habitats are severely dwindled. And this presents it not in a way that's like preachy or meant to make the audience feel guilty, but just to make people aware.
Has it been a different process to Avatar and Korra?
Oh yeah, it's a much different process. I mean, first of all, because it's a documentary and it's a film versus a TV series, and the tone, like a documentary has such a different kind of music functions so differently than in a narrative film or TV. Like it's less connected, less attached to the action. The emotion is often a lot more. I sort of want to say complex, or maybe less pointed. Like it's not so specific. The emotion isn't so specific as in a narrative. It's not like this is necessarily a dark moment or a happy moment or a tense moment. There are those moments, but usually it's somewhere on this sort of continuum. And then the other thing I've been doing is this MTV Scream series, and that's been really fun. It's also a lot of work. The first season was very fast. It's like 4 days to write and a lot of music. And I've been using a double string quartet plus a bass in addition to a couple other instruments. So it's mostly a live score. I'm pretty excited about, because for me that's like where that's where it gets really fun, is just writing for musicians and then like watching like these great musicians in LA bring this stuff to life. Okay,
well, would you like to tell people where they can find your stuff on the internet?
Sure, yeah. Well, my website is jeremyzuckerman.com. There's not a whole lot of info there. It's just the one page right now, but I plan to update it. I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, SoundCloud /Jeremy-Zuckerman. You can find a bunch of clips of various things I've done, and there's some Korra and some Avatar stuff, and I haven't put any Scream stuff up there yet. But some other random stuff, some concert music, some Echo Society stuff. It's a composer collective that I'm a part of, and we put on these big concerts about 2 or 3 times a year in LA. That's super fun.
And most of the Avatar and Korra fandom will probably already know where you are. So.
Oh, okay, yeah. Yeah, they're great.
Whenever you release a track, it's sort of on Tumblr within like 20 seconds.
It's great. Yeah, it's such a great fandom. It's really... I always say, I feel like it's probably the best fandom I'll ever, be a part of.
I mean, it's been over a year since the series ended, and it's still very much, active enough that we can justify doing these interviews, with ordinarily with a show that's no longer on. They'd be like, no, what? Right. Nobody's interested in that. Yes, they are.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's like a movement. It's really a beautiful thing.
I'm sure once the comics come out, it'll boom again.
Yeah. Right. Well, we like stuff. Yep.
Thanks very much for talking to us, Jeremy. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, same here. Thanks, Joel.
No problem.